we are all here to listen to Alina Averchenkova. And this session is part of our Meet the Experts session. We have a number of these at the Parliamentary Pavilion throughout the 2 weeks. And this one is really to look at one of our big themes, which is on the impact of climate framework laws. And so we have Alina's research, which looks at 3 particular case studies you're going to be sharing with us on what are the lessons that can be drawn from Ireland, New Zealand, and Germany. And of course, Alina, you are no stranger to this issue. We've got the number of your fans in the audience. We refer to your work a lot. We've been working with you for many years at Globe, but of course you are at Grantham, the Grantham Research Institute on Energy and the Environment at the London School of Economics. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce the subject and your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Malini. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'll try to shout so that you can hear me at the back, but if you can't, please let me know. I wanted to start first with a little bit of a big picture on what's happening on climate law and climate governance, and that gets into the 3 case studies. So I think the way I see it, and I think some of my colleagues at Grantham as well, that climate change essentially is a political failure. Scientists have been clear for decades about the dangers of climate change, and every next IPCC report is more and more alarming. We're seeing more and more impacts. I think the economics, it's fair to say, and the technology has caught up. We have solutions available to reduce emissions and to some extent to adapt to the impacts of climate change, yet the urgency of action has been lacking. And therefore, what we really urgently need, in my view, is solutions, governance solutions that can tackle the short-term approaches that political systems have due to short electoral cycles, and solutions that will introduce stronger accountability into the system so that every next government is limited in their ability to just do away with climate change policy and lower the objectives, but rather go towards greater ambition. And this is what we have been focusing on at Grantham Research Institute, understanding what are those solutions in terms of governance and how can climate laws help in that context. So if we recall, the global stocktake that concluded last year very clearly pointed to 2 essential problems we currently have: the problem of ambition at the international level, but also the problem of credibility, with many countries putting forward targets but then failing to meet them. And this is where strong national governance, as I said, is absolutely critical. And I'll spend the next couple of minutes talking about what are some of the key elements of national climate governance when we think about it that we should consider. So this piece of work here is based on a collaboration we had with colleagues in India and in South Africa, working both practitioners and academics in the area of climate governance. And we asked ourselves a question: if you thought about, regardless of which country you're in the world, regardless whether your country is an advanced democracy or perhaps whether you are an authoritarian country, there are certain governance functions that every country in the world would need to consider and address to be able to implement effective response to climate change. And obviously, depending on your political system and socioeconomic circumstances, you may choose different ways to address those governance functions. But what is important is that those questions are asked and there are elements put in place that address those. And those are here on the slide, the 9 governance functions. I won't go through each of them, but it kind of gives you an idea. So we need mechanisms to establish the general narrative that sets out objectives for climate policy, and then specific mechanisms to ensure that knowledge and assessment is integrated into that system, that there is mechanism to develop strategy, to integrate objectives and mainstream them across sectors and across governance levels, from national down to local, coordination, We need to raise resources to finance climate action, and we need to ensure there is stakeholder engagement and accountability in the system. And what we find from our work is that climate law is absolutely essential in that. So one could ask, why do we want and need to legislate on climate change? And I wanted to show you the UK example here. This is David Cameron. At the time, he was campaigning as part of the Conservative Party's election program. That was 2005, and this was the picture of him hugging Husky. At the time, Conservative Party has received results of public opinion surveys which show that young voters are giving greater importance to environmental issues. And this is what they came up with: vote blue, go green. This is the same person already in the government, some years past. And this is what media allegedly quoted he said. So quite a change in the narrative. Yet if you look at the UK's climate policy over that period, while there have been some delays in the implementation of certain policies, UK has been going forward with implementation of its system of carbon budgets, reducing emissions over each subsequent carbon budget period and actually complying with those targets. And why was that? Because UK has climate law that sets those objectives, and the government can't just do away with them without the agreement of the parliament. This just shows you the global trends in climate laws. When the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, we tracked about 70 or so climate laws and policies around the world. This is the picture now. There are several thousands of them, and there is virtually no country in the world which doesn't have some form of climate policy or a law related to climate change. But they are not equal. Some countries have strong and ambitious frameworks, and other countries don't. And this is what I want to talk about in the rest of this presentation. So, what are the key elements of climate laws? And I'll talk more about the most impactful ones in a minute based on the case studies. But in this piece of analysis, we have looked at all climate change laws that have integrated net zero targets into the national legislative framework. And we tried to determine what are the key elements of those 9 governance functions that I showed you before. What is the current focus of parliaments at the moment? Which elements in terms of governance infrastructure they're focusing on? And this is what we found out. So what is interesting is that quite a lot of laws focus on those governance functions that set out a narrative, strategy and objectives. So we're quite good on that. You can see those circled at the top. Where we see less focus at the moment is on provisions related to coordination among ministries, which is actually very important, on mechanisms for independent knowledge and advice. For example, independent climate change councils is one such element, and there are still very few laws that mention such mechanisms directly. And we also saw a gap in terms of horizontal mainstreaming of climate change concerns. So basically ensuring that Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Agriculture, not just Climate Ministry, are obliged and required to implement climate change policies and take climate change objectives into their consideration. Now, let me talk about the main question that we're addressing today. Okay, we said climate law is important to maintain this kind of political commitment potentially, but what does actually practice tell us? Do they make a difference? And this is what we asked in this research. We did the same piece of research in 2018, just looking at the UK Climate Change Act, and this time we wanted to broaden this and include larger set of countries. So we picked 3, which is Ireland, Germany, and New Zealand. What is common among these countries is that they've had climate change law for a while, the first climate law, but in all 3 countries, their first climate change legislation was quite weak. For example, in New Zealand, it didn't have net zero targets. It didn't have the system of carbon budgets, which are intermediate steps, intermediate targets between today and 2050. And it didn't have many other elements, and the same in Germany and to some extent in Ireland. But in the last few years, all 3 countries have amended their originally weak climate laws to make them stronger, to integrate net zero targets. In the case of Ireland and New Zealand, to give very strong role to the independent advisory body and to establish also a system of intermediate carbon budgets, steps on how to get to the 2050 target. And the way we approach this research is we interviewed in total 73 stakeholders across the 3 countries, including legislators who were involved in designing climate laws, public officials who were then in charge of implementing those laws, civil society representatives, private sector representatives, media, and also private sector and independent advisory body representatives in all 3 countries. And what we asked them, we didn't give them a survey to fill. It was an open-ended conversation, asking them, do you think climate law made any difference? What were the positive impacts? What were the negative impacts? And then drilling into some of those areas. So here is what we found. This is the kind of the overview of the key messages, the key areas which 73 experts independently came up with the different types of impacts they felt were most important. And at the general level, almost like 70% of the people we interviewed highlighted very strong positive impacts for national climate governance. And I'll unpack that, but in particular, improved coordination, improved stronger responsibilities, allocation of responsibilities along the ministries, integration of climate concerns into the key sectoral policies, and also improved coordination. Fewer respondents, but still quite a large share, also noted positive impacts on the political debate, some on climate policies, and less, but still significant number of respondents also noted positive impacts on citizens and public participation. You will see there are also some negative impacts that were highlighted, and maybe I'll start with that. On the negative side, mainly from campaigners from civil society, what we heard was that there is a dilemma that when you push for climate law to be adopted, it is easier for civil society to mobilize political attention and support, saying that we don't have climate law, we really need to do something about it. However, once you adopt the climate law, but the climate law maybe is not perfect and it needs some improvements, maybe it doesn't have an independent knowledge expert advisory mechanism. Maybe the target is not ambitious enough. What they told us is it becomes very difficult then to mobilize political support for amending the law because it's not so attractive anymore. It also requires deep technical knowledge, which a lot of campaigners don't have, to engage with policymakers on should we include methane emissions or should we, think about negative emissions? That's very technical conversation, which is more difficult for raising political support. So that's where some of the negatives came in terms of, you have to be careful to strike that balance between, using political opportunity to pass the law and trying to strive for kind of the perfect one. So let me talk about some specific examples within of the impacts within those kind of general categories that I outlined. So as I said, by far the strongest area of impact which respondents noted was on climate governance. And there, one key area was the way that climate law defines accountability for implementation. And I wanted to show you this. I know that I see there are some lawyers at least here, but I think this is of interest, I think, to any member of parliament or anyone who is involved in drafting a climate law. You have here example of the text in terms of defining how government departments are responsible for taking into account the targets and provisions of climate law in their activities. And you see a striking difference here. In Germany, the German climate law says that bodies discharging public duties shall give due consideration to the purpose of the climate law and the target set for its implementation. The strongest language is in Ireland. It says basically that all public bodies in the activities that they do, regardless whether they work on energy, on water, on agriculture, all public bodies have to ensure that decisions are consistent with the Climate Action Plan, National Climate Action Strategy, Adaptation Framework, and Sectoral Adaptation Plans, as well as objectives of the law. Compare that to New Zealand, which says public authorities should take it into consideration if they think fit. Basically, they don't have to worry about it if they don't think it's important. And what is really interesting, talking to the stakeholders, we could see that in action, the Irish formulation really makes difference. We already could hear from public sector actors that this provision has ensured that, for example, major infrastructure projects in Ireland, some of them have been delayed or even not approved because they were not in line with the climate change objectives and the climate change plan. Where if we think about New Zealand, that weak formulation didn't really lead to the law having the same impact. So what we put in the text of the law makes a huge difference. And this is one example where it does. So that's one example in terms of climate governance. We could see decentralized accountability. So what we want to achieve with the climate law is that it's not just the Ministry of Climate which is responsible for carrying this agenda, because they are usually, let's be honest, not the strongest ministry, and also they can't do it alone. And this is where climate laws in the three countries we have seen to different extent are actually contributing to diffusing that accountability to all of the key players in the government. The second impact I wanted to highlight is the role of climate laws in promoting and enabling subnational action. What we have seen, again, Ireland is a good example. Their climate change law requires local authorities to prepare and implement climate change plans which are in line with the National Climate Change Plan. And what is interesting is that before the climate change law, local authorities in Ireland only were able to work on adaptation. Mitigation was not part of their remit. But after this law was passed, the local authorities now not only can, but they must work on mitigation as well as on adaptation. They also have to prepare the plan. So what we saw in Ireland, there are more people being hired into local authorities to work on climate change. There is more collaboration between local authorities, neighboring local authorities. And there are early signs that there is also resources being mobilized to enable local authorities to implement climate action in a better and more efficient manner. And finally, on governance, accountability is a huge one. And there are different ways in which climate laws in the three countries we have looked at strengthen accountability. One obvious one is enabling climate litigation. In all three countries, there have been cases in court, climate litigation. In some of them, that actually was what enabled the adoption of the more ambitious climate law. And again, there are some colleagues here who actually work on climate litigation, so we can have a discussion afterwards. But having a climate law and a framework which is instilled and specified in the law enables litigation and makes it much more straightforward if the government is not complying with the targets set in the law. So in that sense, that's one way. Another way is that climate change laws in 3 countries we have looked at also establish provisions for the governments in terms of reporting, regular reporting, for example, annual reporting on progress with implementation of emission reductions and meeting the targets. And they also assign important role to the independent expert advisory bodies. For example, a National Climate Change Commission in New Zealand. They are similar to the UK's Climate Change Committee, in which they are composed of independently appointed experts which are not affiliated with the government or with political parties. And their role is A, to propose the level of carbon budget, so those targets for every 5-year periods. But B, they have to produce independent assessment of how well the government is doing and implementing the climate law. And in Ireland, it's the same system. And if there are gaps in the implementation, that serves as an important accountability mechanism to hold the government stronger into account for the targets set under the law. Now let me talk about political debate. I showed you David Cameron and the expectation that climate law would help us protect against backsliding and perhaps against policy reversal. So the question is, does that actually happen? So here it's more complicated. We have discussed it with experts, and I think the feeling overall was that the consensus kind of was that climate laws definitely help and protect against long-term targets. So it's very difficult to reverse a net zero target that is set in the law. But there is a but, especially if the law was passed with strong cross-party consensus. And New Zealand is a good case in point there. In our report, we give more detail on that. New Zealand had a very divisive political debate on climate change for decades. But when Minister Shaw was appointed as a Minister for Environment, he came from private sector background. He basically, according to the stakeholders we interviewed, he understood that unless this political rivalry is climate is taking out of it, New Zealand climate policy will not progress. And so he basically made a lot of effort to work with the National Party, which is a conservative party in New Zealand, to table the climate change, the Net Zero Carbon Act, to table it as a bipartisan bill, truly bipartisan bill from Labour and National Party. And what it did is that recently there has been an election in New Zealand, and National Party in alliance with ACT, which is a far-right party which opposes climate change, they won the election. They won the election. And ACT, the right-wing party, was pushing for basically backsliding on a number of goals. They were actually in favor potentially of abolishing the Climate Act together or doing away with the National Climate Change Commission. That's what we were told in the interviews. But that didn't happen, because the National Party said, well, actually it's our climate change law, it's not Labour's climate change law. It's been adopted by political consensus, so the law stays. There's still maybe there's still challenges in terms of how the policy will be implemented now, but at least the climate law has protected those objectives. Where we see less protection from the climate law is on backsliding in terms of specific policies that the government adopts. And we could see it in UK as well, when the previous government actually took some backward steps last year in terms of dismantling some of the net zero policies that they previously put in place. So the specific policies, the government has more leeway to change. And so our message here is that it's not enough to just pass the climate law. There needs to be constant political pressure from the parliament, from the civil society, to ensure that there is no backsliding on policies underneath that. Then the area in terms of policies, I think that's one that is to be expected. We expect climate law to enable climate policies. What was interesting that we discovered in our study that climate laws in those 3 countries didn't just enable climate policies, they also enabled planning reforms, the reforms of the planning system, which Actually, in many countries, it's one of the key barriers. The delays with permitting for renewable energy projects, the outdated planning codes that don't allow a lot of the kind of new technologies to be introduced. And so we have seen planning reforms being linked directly to climate change legislation in those countries that we have looked at. The area where we still see some gaps is citizen participation and citizen awareness. I think what we find from our study is that debate about climate law, but most of all litigation, when lawsuits happen, media writes about them, and that's what increases kind of public attention and public awareness about climate change. But the question is, some of that actually is quite negative media, because, you know, it's about government not doing well, therefore we need a lawsuit, and therefore it creates this slightly negative narrative around that. So that there are some negatives as well came in the discussion on the impact of that, because we don't want the constant message to the public to be, well, we've set ambitious targets, but we failed to meet them yet ever again, because over time that basically loosens trust, deteriorate trust that citizens have in our ability to address climate crisis. So I think that's one other message that came up from our research, something to be aware of. Now, what are the key elements of climate laws that we saw from our research as being most impactful? So I just wanted to highlight a few. So those 3 countries we have looked at, and the same for the UK as well, so 4 countries in total. Targets and carbon budgets. All interviewees equivocally saying that this is the core. This is what drives a lot of those impacts that we have talked to. Having targets is what gives different actors within the government clear benchmarks to work towards, but also to be assessed against. Secondly, planning and policy processes. All of the climate laws that we have looked at, all of the 4 case studies, establish an obligation for the government to prepare integrated climate action plans, multi-sectoral, economy-wide, and with specific timeframes to ensure that targets are met. Those provisions were the ones that actually pushed the government agencies, not directly usually responsible for climate change, such as we were saying, Ministry of Transport, Energy, Planning, to work together and to implement, to integrate climate considerations into their operations. Public sector mandates we just discussed. I showed you the examples of 3 countries. That was seen as absolutely key. And finally, the provisions for regular reporting and creation of shared knowledge base for understanding the gaps in the implementation. And independent advisory councils is the key mechanism for that. So this is just a summary kind of how those impacts happen. So those impacts happen. There are some core building blocks that I've just talked about, which are provisions embedded in the law itself, in the text of the law. So this is this area here, and we just talked about that. But climate laws also make impacts through indirect channels, and those are institutional capacity. What we saw in all 4 countries after the law has been adopted, the government at different levels had to increase their capacity to work on climate change. That means new staff, it means training existing staff, it also means collaborating in a different way. So that's indirect. It's not in the law, but that's the impact that the law has. Litigation, we already talked about. Climate law enables court cases to run more smoothly and efficiently. But I have to say here as well, we have to be aware that a lot of litigation is not good either. It's the same as my message on public kind of public awareness, because litigation is costly. It costs not just in terms of financial resources, it costs in terms of attention that it takes from the government as well to respond to the case. And so ideally, we don't want this happening, but it's important to have that as a remedy when things don't go the way that is planned. Then this is another way. Many climate laws enable subsequent governmental policies or subsidiary legislation. For example, let me give an example of Mexico. Let's go to emerging economy. The climate change law, framework climate change law adopted in 2012 wasn't very strong. It didn't really have a net zero target, for example, but at the time that was the period where few countries did. But it had certain institutional elements and it established some targets for 2030, I believe. But what it did then, that law, by being weak by itself, enabled a much more ambitious energy transition law, which was adopted in Mexico just a few years after, because that law could cite and refer to the climate change legislation, to the objectives established in it, and go further in establishing more specific targets for the energy sector. What we also discovered through our research is that climate laws give very important signaling. They have an important signaling function by directing investment by private sector. So even if sometimes there are not direct targets established for companies in the climate law, once the law is there, private sector starts preparing for what is to come, and that impacts their decision making. And finally, I think we already mentioned a little bit, climate change laws serve as a vehicle for campaigning, for advocacy groups. Now, I think all of you probably have a question. Well, what about emissions? And what about climate resilience? Do climate laws actually lead to those outcomes directly? Well, this is an incredibly difficult question to answer empirically, mostly because most of these climate laws I've just talked about are quite young. So the Net Zero Carbon Act, the Germans, climate law in the Irish one, they haven't even been in place for 5 years. It's been just a couple of years. So for those 3 countries, what we could do is we have looked at the decoupling, sort of how the GDP goes. So it's similar. This is the graph for UK. And I'm showing UK because UK climate change law has been in place since 2008. So we have longer data series here. But you can see that the economy of the UK has been going up. That's a blue line, the gross domestic product. Yet the emissions have been going down. Consistent. And this is the time where the climate law was passed. So you could see that there is the sharper kind of decoupling, we say, the economists call it decoupling, so or divorcing between the economic growth and the emissions. Now, can we attribute all of that to the climate change law alone? No, we can't, because there was also, at the time, the UK was still part of the European Union. There were European legislation as well in place, and then there are specific policies which were not. But we can see that this was kind of a decisive moment because the speed of decoupling has increased. In the 3 countries, Ireland, Germany, and New Zealand, what we could see that the 3 climate laws, definitely there is evidence that they are playing an important role in mobilizing finance, in directing more public finance towards climate change agenda, and also creating specific funds at the national level in all 3 countries. We also saw in Ireland, which has specific reference to just transition in the climate law, that focus has led to creation of specific institutions and also dedicated funding for just transition. So that was an important impact of climate law. But effectively, to understand how much climate law impacts emissions, we would have to have kind of longer time series there. But we are seeing positive impacts. On adaptation, we weren't able to do much on that because the three laws, they didn't have as much focus on adaptation as on mitigation. So I'll finish with a couple of recommendations that we see from this research. I don't know why the graphics are not showing, but basically the first message for countries which don't have a national climate change law, I think our advice based on these studies is that it's definitely worth adopting one or amending one if your law is weak, because a strong climate law can really help drive national climate policy. It's important to incorporate the most impactful building blocks that we have talked about, the targets, the planning mechanism, the public sector mandates, and the mechanisms for accountability and reporting. And give particular attention to ensuring that you have provisions for coordination, both across the government departments, but also vertically from the national to subnational and local level. And important, consider how are you ensuring that climate policy targets both on mitigation and adaptation and also the progress and implementation of them. How do you ensure that it's based on independent, best scientific and economic and social knowledge? And this is where independent advisory bodies are really playing an important role. If you haven't engaged much with this topic, there is now an international network of independent advisory bodies. It includes such bodies both from developed and developing countries. They are here at the COP. They have a pavilion and they will have some events as well. So go visit them and learn about what they're doing. It's really, really exciting stuff. And finally, I think I talked about that, but for political strategy, it's really key if we want to succeed that climate law is really based on broad-based political consensus, that it's not a one-party exercise because it won't last, it won't withstand political change. And important gap that I think we need to fill going forward is to ensure there are stronger provisions for public participation, because that's also what European climate policy is teaching us at the moment with the strong backlash we're getting in some countries from citizens, is that if you don't involve citizens up front, again, these efforts are going to fail. So I'll finish then. And I just wanted to draw your attention, if you don't know, at the Grantham Research Institute, we have this resource for parliaments, but also for policy researchers, which is called Climate Change Laws of the World. It's open access, free of charge. We cover all of the countries of the world, and we track all climate and climate-related policies and laws. And you can search by keywords, you can search by country. Yeah, if you're interested, get in touch with us. We're always happy to show you how this works and to engage with you. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much. That was amazing tour de force. We now have about 10 minutes. And while you're catching your breath, so just a little bit of background, of course. This is a fantastic reference, the one that you see, the Climate Change Laws of the World. And actually, it comes from work that Globe had done. So Globe, as you'll know, is first organization that created a platform for members of parliament to engage on these issues within the intergovernmental process. And it was started in 1991. And just going back to some of the striking figures that you mentioned. So over the 2000s, we started pulling together a compendium of the climate change legislation that was emerging. And I think it was 2014, 2015 that we had the very last one, the Climate Change Laws of the World, and that then became the Climate Change Laws of the World public resource that you see on the LSE site. One of the things that has come out most strongly in our work, Alina, that we have done, is the influence that Western climate change laws is having on other parts of the world, for good or ill. Because we did a study with the Climate Vulnerable Forum 2 years ago. And in that, we surveyed the climate change laws and policies of 55 members of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. And what we found was a very high degree of imitation of what is already there in existing climate change laws and policies in countries like the UK. And that was a shortcut. There are downsides of that. And the downsides are it doesn't reflect your national reality. And where your national reality is that should be a much more of a focus on mitigation and adaptation than emissions reductions, it sends the wrong signal. So that's a very important message also from the work that we have done, which is very complementary to yours, which is please make a note that your setting of your national framework and the policies, the measures, the targets reflects the domestic reality, in particular the domestic economic and institutional reality, because otherwise you will be focusing on the wrong thing. So for years we have net zero targets in some of the most vulnerable countries on the planet who collectively commit 0.5% of the world's emissions. Their focus should not be on emissions reductions. It should be on resilience and adaptation. And that is absent, largely. So there's a real need for a corrective so that we're not just pushing a model. One size does not fit all, of course. So having made that point, I think this is obviously there's going to be a lot of questions because you presented some really interesting data. There was a question earlier about can we quantify the impact that has been made, and you answered that question, I think. We just don't have we don't have enough time as yet to showcase that. But so if you can come back over here, please, Alina, and then we'll open it up to questions, comments from the audience. You will have to shout because these microphones are not for amplification.
That's all right.
And introduce yourself because this is going out on live stream. Thank you.
I'm Bolek Matuszewski. I'm representing Client Earth at this COP, and as you know, or as you may not know, you need the mic anyway. Oh, I'm very sorry. Yes, I'm Bolek Matuszewski from Client Earth, and we do a lot of litigation surrounding climate issues, and we also work on framework climate laws. I have a few observations and maybe also a few questions. My one observation concerning litigation would be that I think we have to sort of bear in mind that we are dealing with countries that are civil law countries and common law countries. And so the example that was given with Ireland and New Zealand, where there has been climate litigation concerning framework climate laws, those are obviously common law countries where that is possible without a particular statutory basis. But in a country like mine, I'm from Poland, without a framework climate law that specifically says that you can actually sue regarding the targets that are in that framework climate law, litigation would be impossible. And actually New Zealand, if I'm not mistaken, they have a provision that says that you can sue for not attaining a target, but you can only do that after the 2050 target has been missed. So you will be able to litigate after 2050. So I would, as far as litigation is concerned, I would look at those issues, and also, as you said, too much litigation is a problem. I mean, it would be difficult, I think, to convince many governments to implement a framework climate law if your stated policy would be, well, let's allow citizens to litigate without limitation that framework climate law. That is a concern of governments that we have heard that, you know, will implement this framework climate law, but we will open ourselves up to litigation, too much litigation as a result. So that is something that I suppose would have to be navigated. But as far as questions are concerned, I have two basic questions. One would be the targets and the emissions budgets. I came across a study by the UK Climate Council a few years ago regarding the Scottish framework climate law, where they talked about whether targets should be used or emissions budgets should be used in the law. And I think, if I remember correctly, they opted in that report to actually advocate for targets instead of emissions budgets. So I was wondering, in your research, whether you have come across that issue and whether your research indicates that it would be better just to focus on targets or whether emissions budgets are a better approach. And secondly, an issue that I've come across in Poland, whenever we propose that adaptation plans, for example, should be implemented on a national and subnational level, the response is, well, there are already so many plans that have to be adopted, particularly at subnational level where there's no capacity, that adding plans to the framework climate law or requiring additional plans to be published, that would be actually a very big problem for those particularly smaller towns and villages that have a capacity issue. So I was wondering whether you have come across that issue as well. So thank you very much.
Over to you, Elina.
Thank you so much. These are really great points. So I think I'll go to the questions first. On the Scottish Climate Change Act, Scotland actually is at the moment in the process of amending its Climate Change Act. And we have prepared a submission into that process and also gave evidence to the select committee focusing on that. And that question came up actually. The discussion there is that should you have annual emission targets for every year, or should you have budget which covers, say, 4 to 5 years? And so our take on that has been based on the countries we have looked at. Having a carbon budget gives the government and also private sector more flexibility in terms of preparing and actually ensuring that the target is met where you have a target, and also to make accounting emissions sort of take into account with the progress that has been reached. And that was also the view of the Climate Change Committee by the UK. So we actually agreed with their assessment based on what we have heard from other countries. And one case there to look at is Germany. Germany had well, there the issue was not so much as annual targets, but they had sectoral targets which were established for each sector. And basically the challenge was that it was too rigid, the framework was too rigid, and so some sectors lobbied against the climate law, and basically it led to the law being amended very recently. So I'd say we would agree that having 4-year or 5-year budgets is a more effective approach from the countries we have looked at. And your other question was on local authorities. That's a very big concern. You can't give new obligations to parts of the government, and in particular local authorities, which in many countries are already overwhelmed, without thinking about providing them with additional resources in some ways. So I think that's a very key point, and that came up in many countries we have looked at, in particular in developing country context. I think that's that's really important. However, what we also heard is that there are some opportunities, because it's not always about, you know, just putting new things on the table without taking something old off the table. I think by having a requirement to integrate climate consideration into the planning processes at the local and subnational level, what you're trying to achieve is that not that local authorities necessarily have to do more, it's just that they have to focus on different things and prioritize different solutions, different investments. So I think there is an initial capacity issue in terms of staff and actually having technical expertise. But over long run, in terms of the investment that will be required to implement those plans, the idea is that it's not always one-to-one increase in the financing required. But yeah, that is an issue, I think.
Can I just add to that? So if you think about the role of local authorities, we now have a new generation of climate change legislation which is coming through. I think of Kenya, in where actually it's not just at the federal level where these commitments are being made in statutes, but at the subnational level. And Kenya is a very good example of that, where not only are the local authorities, the counties, empowered, but they're also actively working together to create the funding basis for implementation of their statutory commitments. And I think also of this in the context of the UK. So the UK Climate Change Act, of course, is the gold standard, 2008, but it's also got the number of weaknesses. And the weakness is that it does not provide a statutory duty, as you said, for local authorities. Now, this is being seen as a problem. And local authorities are now coming together and actively urging a change, devolution, so that they are required by statutes to act on these issues. Because in the absence of statutes, they can come up with any number of climate emergency declarations. So if I think of London's 33 boroughs, the majority have issued climate emergency declarations, but not a single one of them is bound by statute to deliver on any of them, with the exception of the Greater London Authority. And this is worth remarking, because it also goes to who are the drivers for change. When London first acquired a mayor in 2000, there was a visionary deputy mayor called Nicky Gavron, who sadly passed away this year. And Nicky recognized that without statute, without building it into the Greater London Authority Act, a commitment to climate action, it would not happen. And that was very wise, because the GLA Act requires any mayor, the GLA, to act on climate change, to have a strategy in place. And that has meant that regardless of whether it is a Labour mayor or a Conservative mayor like Boris Johnson, there has been that continuity. So we do have a number of precedents where we've got good practice in terms of the legislation at the subnational level. We know what to do now. The question is, how do we act on ensuring that the political consensus is there to devolve down now? This is a very live issue because, as you'll know, the presidency here has issued a new urban initiative called MAPS, the Multi-Level Action Agenda for cities and regions. And this, for the first time in any COP decision, includes members of parliaments. So Globe has signed up to that. And what this requires now is for members of parliament to work cohesively with sub-national administrations, local government, municipal authorities, to create the body of law which is required to ensure that there is implementation at the sub-national level. So this is something that, CASA, the Azerbaijani presidency, we have now. So it's one big advance to what we had before. So those are just points of information. The floor is still open. So any further questions or comments before we bring it to a close in the next couple of minutes? The gentleman in the back, please. Please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, I'm from KPMG Japan. Nice to meet you. I could not participate from the beginning, so sorry if I missed out anything. I do advisory for the private sector, and I want to ask you about the disclosure laws that is coming in Europe. CSRD, maybe CSDDD and everything. They require that companies disclose on their climate change issues. I am seeing that Japanese companies are also complying with it because they have subsidiaries in the EU. And it's just very greenwash, should I say, because the implementation plan that they have on climate change is not so, in detail yet. But they have to disclose this anyway, so they do that kind of disclosure. I was wondering, since you mentioned about this climate legislation and laws and everything coming into place, they should be like in parallel, because the companies cannot disclose what they cannot do, but there is no law that requires them to do something regarding climate change from a legal perspective. So I was wondering how we should, balance that out, the disclosure and the implementation and the laws.
Thank you for the question. That's a really important issue, and I think that there is much political debate about that. I think, in general, disclosure has been seen as the first step, a necessary step, at least to find out what is happening on the side of private sector, but also to be more transparent for investors. And of course, in the ideal world, it should go hand in hand with regulation that sets targets for companies. Unfortunately, that ideal situation does not happen in many places at the moment. What we are seeing, though, that climate legislation has been driving disclosure requirements. I think that has been going hand in hand in many countries. In Europe, we have two examples. French climate change that I would highlight, the France's climate change law and the one in Spain. Those are framework climate change acts, but they integrate requirements for disclosure for climate and climate-related impacts. In New Zealand, such requirement is not integrated in the climate change law, but what we could observe is the adoption of climate law has stimulated adoption of statutory requirement for private sector to disclose information. So in that sense, yeah, those developments are going hand in hand in many countries. But I think you're absolutely right that the essential step then is to actually establish a standard for what private sector, how they should be developing their strategy and report on it, but actually follow through with targets. In some countries, like in New Zealand, they have an internal emission trading scheme, so they have a mechanism, but that only covers some sectors. So yeah, I think I would agree with you that those should go hand in hand.
Yeah. And I just to add a little bit more information, because this is a very important question. Thank you for raising it. Because of course, even if you don't have a national climate framework law or climate legislation, your private sector will still be subject to the climate change legislation of the countries to which they're exporting and importing from. So that's a completely different channel, which is very often ignored by lawmakers in this discussion. And so this has come absolutely through principally the leadership of the European Commission and the European Parliament, because we do have the new directives on disclosure, and they're very hard-hitting. And actually, there are companies who are required by law to have climate change transition plans. And that is a key factor in their ability to get cheaper capital. So it's not that they are off the hook. Many of them are actually actively on the hook. And through their supply chains, they are now exporting that requirement to their businesses in other parts of the world. So we see that this is actively forming, and actually we're going to have a presentation during the course of the 2 weeks by the Transition Plan Task Force. You'll know that this has been running for the last 2 years. They have recently issued their reports. It's a UK initiative. It came out of GFANZ, COP26. And so we will be getting their report. So please do come back for that. There's a lot more to say. There's a lot more questions to ask Alina, who is a font of knowledge on these issues. Alina, you're going to be back with us on the 14th, and you're going to be talking about net zero and climate change. So, but we have to bring this session to a close. So, of course, this has been live streamed, and after COP, we are going to make this recording available on the playlist. So please put your hands together in the traditional way to thank our wonderful presenter.
Thank you so much for having me. And just to mention, if you're interested in just transition issues and legislation, we'll have a side event on the 14th. So please do come along as well. 4 o'clock to 6:15 in the afternoon. Yeah.
For those of you who do want to know more about what's being planned, not just here, but in other parts of COP29, please do sign up for our regular reports and broadcasts. We have a daily update, which is there. And please ask my colleague Nameka if you have any questions about how to get signed up for that. Thank you.